The night sky over Crimea did not glow, it roared. In the early hours of October 6, 2025, a swarm of Ukrainian drones slashed through the dark toward Feodosia, the biggest oil storage complex in Russian-occupied Crimea, and turned it into a torch, visible for tens of kilometers. Minutes later, the peninsula's most important fuel lifeline was a column of fire, its shockwaves rippling across a region that has tried for 2 years to pretend that war could be kept at a distance. Ukraine's general staff did not whisper the news. They confirmed it. The largest terminal on the peninsula had been hit, and it was burning hard. Feodosia matters because it isn't just a tank farm. It's a hub. The facility can hold roughly 250,000 tons of fuel and moves it by rail, road, and sea. A multifunctional node that keeps vehicles humming, ships fueled, and generators alive. Take that out and you don't merely light up the night. You jackhammer the logistics under the foundation of Russia's entire occupation machine. That's why the plume was not just smoke, it was strategy. According to Ukraine's general staff, the strike hit precisely where it cuts the deepest, on a terminal that shuttles fuel between all 3 major modes of transport. This isn't dramatic flair, it's the map. And Feodosia wasn't the only tremor in the same window of darkness. Reports of blasts rolled in near the Saki and Kacha airfields, 2 fixtures of Russia's air operations in Crimea. A pro-Ukrainian local channel described the oil terminal fire as visible from tens of kilometers away, a bonfire that had its own horizon. Russia's Ministry of Defense, as if trying to smother the blaze with numbers, claimed it intercepted 251 drones overnight, 40 of them over the occupied peninsula. Those claims could not be independently verified, but even if every intercept was real, the fire says what statistics can't. Enough got through. One more blow landed that night with far less spectacle but potentially equal sting. Ukrainian forces also struck an ammunition depot tied to a logistics battalion of Russia's 18th Combined Arms Army. The formal battle damage assessment will take time, but the target selection tells the story. Oil and ammo in the same night. Fuel and teeth. You don't have to be Clausewitz to understand the intent. You just have to watch what stops moving. If the name Feodosia rings familiar, it should. Ukraine hit the depot back in October 2024. Hard enough that Russian-appointed authorities declared a state of emergency. The message since then has been consistent. Crimea is not a sanctuary. It is a magazine room built on the waterline, and magazines, literal and figurative, can be made to detonate. The strike comes in the middle of a months-long, methodical Ukrainian campaign to hammer Russia's energy complex, not just in Crimea, but across the country. The repercussions have been real, measurable, and visible. By late September, fuel shortages in Crimea and Sevastopol had worsened so badly that roughly half of gas stations halted gasoline sales. Half. In a peninsula whose supply lines already twist across a vulnerable bridge and contested waters. Russian business reporting mapped out the shortages spreading across the southern federal district, a region Moscow now claims includes Crimea. When the pumps run dry, you can't hide it. People notice. Armies notice faster. Zoom out a notch, and the pattern becomes even clearer. Since August 2025, 16 of Russia's 38 refineries have been struck by drones, according to Financial Times reporting cited in Ukrainian coverage. Diesel exports tumbled to their lowest levels since 2020. That may sound like an energy sector footnote, but if you've ever tried to move a tank battalion or feed a combined arms army, you know diesel is not a footnote. It's momentum in liquid form. Feodosia was the right target, because it sits at the intersection of energy and movement, and the modern Russian war machine guzzles both. So what does the Feodosia blaze actually do on the battlefield? First, it forces Russia to reroute. Every rail spur, ferry schedule, and convoy plan built around that terminal gets rewritten under pressure. Second, it raises the cost of defending Crimea. If oil is now combustible risk, more air defenses, more counter-drone units, and more patrols must be peeled away from elsewhere to protect what still burns. Third, it compounds a trend. The Kerch Bridge, coastal ferries, and now the main storage node. Each link repeatedly harassed until redundancy turns to scarcity. A logistics officer's worst enemy is not destruction, it's unpredictability. The Feodosia strike injects exactly that. There's also a psychological element, and it's not small. The image of an oil terminal roaring like a furnace is a message to Russian soldiers on the peninsula. Your rear is a front. And to Crimean civilians, the war you were told would remain distant lives next door. War planners speak of deep battle, the art of attacking not just troops but the arteries that feed them. Ukraine is turning that doctrine into a weekly weather report. And with that, we pivot to the other half of tonight's story, because Feodosia isn't just a headline. It's a data point on a larger curve, the slow, grinding erosion of Russian capacity. 3.5 years into a war the Kremlin once sold as a lightning campaign, the numbers have stopped flattering Moscow. The summary is brutal. Russia is running out of the things that make an army, not just tanks, everything. And the timeline isn't abstract. Analysts warn of real limits by 2026 if losses and tempo continue on present trends. Let's talk about what's actually been lost. Visually confirmed, not rumor. Open source trackers that only count what the lens can see list more than 22,600 pieces of Russian military equipment destroyed or damaged by September 2025. That's roughly double Ukraine's documented losses, even before you factor in the gap between what's confirmed and what's simply gone. Within that number sits the heart of the matter: about 13,000 armoured vehicles, including over 4,100 tanks. Those are not antiques in a museum ledger. They're modernised T-72s, T-82s and T-92s that Russian propaganda once paraded as unstoppable. They've proved stoppable enough. What did Russia start with? On paper, the country entered the war with roughly 3,300 tanks in active service and a shadowy horde of 5,000 to 17,500 more in storage, Soviet inheritance in various states of rust. The mismatch was always going to be attrition versus restoration. Moscow tried to close the gap by producing around 250 modernized tanks a year and dredging storage for anything with a turret that could be coaxed back to life. By mid-war, images of T-62s on trains signaled that the barrel was being scraped. By late 2024, reports of T-34s being pressed into service didn't just scrape the barrel, they perforated it. When your frontline mix includes a tank design from World War II, it's fair to say the showroom is closed. Even that patchwork plan has faltered. Satellite imagery of refit yards suggests Russia's ability to restore tanks slid from over 120 a month in 2022 to roughly 35 by mid-2025. That decline is physics and arithmetic, not just sanctions. The best conditioned hulls come out first, fast. What remains in the yards by year 3 is older, more corroded, more cannibalized, and more expensive to resurrect. Meanwhile, as Ukraine becomes more efficient at destroying damaged vehicles in place or torching evacuation routes with drones, fewer hulks make it back for repairs. It's hard to refurbish what never leaves the kill zone. Attrition perversely accelerates as the herd thins. Ukrainian General Staff figures showed Russia losing roughly 1,000 armoured vehicles per month in the first half of 2024. That average spiked to over 3,000 per month by year's end. Why? Because the battlefield evolved. Drones graduated from harassing to hunting, from disabling to annihilating. And fewer armoured pushes mean fewer overlapping fields of fire and less mutual protection. More windows for a quadcopter to slip in with an explosive that costs less than a tank crew's launch. Think of it as the opposite of herd immunity. As the formation shrinks, each survivor is easier to isolate and kill. The International Institute for Strategic Studies put the prognosis bluntly. If Russia continues at the pace and loss rates of 2024, it will not have sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026. And that's not an op-ed flourish, it's a planning note written in the margins of a war. And you can already see the translation on the ground. Russia's assaults rely less on armor and more on human bodies and improvisation. Dirt bikes, scooters, even antique motorcycles with sidecars. The kind of stuff that looks like a cosplay convention until you remember people are dying on them. Dark humor aside, this is what depletion looks like when doctrine refuses to admit it. If you want a single image that explains the vulnerability, look down. Russian tanks are designed with autoloaders and carousel ammunition stored under the turret. Great for keeping crews at 3 and rates of fire high. Terrible when explosive dropped munitions or roaming drones attack from above. The thin top armor, the proximity of propellant charges, the cascade of sympathetic detonations. One well-placed strike and a 45-ton machine becomes a jack-in-the-box. We've all seen the turrets cartwheeling. It's dramatic on social media. It's catastrophic in a brigade's order of battle. Ukraine didn't invent physics. It weaponized angles. Then there's the myth that refuses to roll. The T-14 Armada, Moscow's poster child for next-gen armored warfare. Lauded, teased, occasionally photographed, and allegedly trialed near the front in 2023, it was later pulled back. A production run that looks like a handful of showpieces. A cost profile that makes accountants cry, and a battlefield where drones punish any tall silhouette. None of this is fertile ground for a flagship. If propaganda were armor, the Armada would be invincible. Unfortunately for it, the battlefield grades on penetration, not press releases. Quality control hasn't helped. Reports of reactive armor blocks filled with literal bricks or empty shells are the kind of details you'd dismiss as satire if they didn't keep turning up in wreckage photos. Western tanks have their own sins, but a supply chain that swaps explosives for clay is less a sin than a confession. Again, the pattern is the point. Corruption and corner cutting corrode warfighting long before they show up at the front. You can't patch that with a paint job. Here's where Feodosia ties back in, like a plot twist you should have seen coming. An army that's hemorrhaging equipment and struggling to restore it is exquisitely sensitive to energy pressure. Damage enough refineries, torch enough depots, shatter enough storage hubs, and you do to fuel what drones did to armor. You make the herd thin and the survivors vulnerable. Crimea's fuel shortage, half the station's halting gasoline sales, was already a sign that the system is operating on the edge. Set the largest terminal ablaze, and you push that edge closer. Logistics officers don't sleep much on a good day. On bad ones, they smoke on catwalks and watch the fire. So, what does the next year look like if these curves hold? Expect Russia to conserve its remaining armor, leaning harder on infantry, artillery, and standoff strikes. Expect more improvisation, anti-drone cages on everything, cheap electronic warfare in every trench, and a grim reliance on massed bodies to close gaps that tanks once bridged. Expect Ukraine to double down on deep strikes, refineries, depots, railheads, and bridges. Every kilometer of rear area becomes contested. Every convoy becomes a bet. And in that environment, one Feodosia-style strike buys you more than one night of headlines. It buys you weeks of friction. There's also the question of time. 2026 isn't a magical wall where Russia hits 0 tanks and the war stops. It's a threshold where offensive capacity, rolling, armored, mechanized momentum falls below the level needed to punch through layered defenses. Past that, you get attacks that look like meat grinders and map lines that barely twitch. You can win ugly for a while. You can't win empty. And that's why each warehouse flame and each cratered rail yard matters more now than ever. Does any of this guarantee Ukrainian success? Number. War is a casino where the house odds are written in blood, not math. But trends are real. Drones are cheap and clever. Smart munitions punish bad geometry. Energy networks don't grow back overnight. And a country slowly eating its stored legacy to keep 20th century armor alive in a 21st century killbox is on a timer, whether it admits it or not. If you're the Kremlin, the good news is that time still moves at 1 second per second. The bad news is, it never stops. There's a strategic coda here, and it's about narrative as much as numbers. Every time a refinery howls, every time an oil terminal becomes a beacon, every time a storage yard turns into a crater field, it tells Russian troops and citizens, this war has consequences you cannot paper over. That's not propaganda. That's physics, accounting, and fire. The Feodosia blaze is a signal flare fired into a black sky. The rear is not safe, the reserves are not infinite, and the attrition you outsourced to the future has arrived in the present. One final note before we roll the end credits. If you're wondering whether Ukraine can sustain this tempo of deep strikes, Remember what made the bonus shells so terrifying for Russian armor: precision from above, sensors that ignore smoke, and an ability to find the weak point and hit it again. Those same principles now guide the long-range drone and strike campaign, where once Ukraine had to fight column by column, today it can target the arteries. You don't need to chase every tank if you can starve the depots that feed all of them. That's cold mathematics with very warm consequences. And it's why a single night's fire in Feodosia could echo louder than a month of artillery on the line. So here we are, a peninsula that burns, a stock of armor that thins, a calendar that refuses to slow down. Russia can adapt, armies always do, or it can double down on a style of war that the battlefield keeps punishing. Ukraine, for its part, is showing that it understands how to make each strike do more than scar the ground. It's trying to change the war's math, and wars, in the end, are decided by arithmetic as much as audacity. The question that hangs over everything is simple and cruel. When the fuel runs low and the tanks run out, what replaces them? If the answer is men on scooters, the future of this war looks less like victory parades and more like long, smoky nights over places like Feodosia, where the sky doesn't glow, it roars. And for anyone keeping score at home, yes, the Russian MOD can claim to shoot down hundreds of drones in a night, but if even a handful turn terminals into furnaces, then the interception rate is academic. It's the fires that count. It's the shortages people feel. It's the tank parks that get emptier while the repair bays slow to a crawl. It's the battlefield that watches all of it and adjusts accordingly. That's the story, that's the arc. And unless something changes dramatically, the end of that arc points to a 2026, where Russia still has soldiers and slogans, but fewer tools with which to impose its will. The math is merciless. The footage is, too. We'll leave you with this. Strategy is making your opponent choose between bad options. Ukraine's deep strike campaign and Russia's attrition spiral are converging to offer exactly that. Defend your rear and your front loosens. Push your front and your rear explodes. Either way, the fuel gauge is dropping, the tank roster is shrinking, and the calendar reads October 2025. The clock is not neutral, it's a combatant. And right now, it's fighting on the side of the fire. Yes, scooters in a war zone are as practical as umbrellas in a hurricane. No, the T-14 Armata isn't shy, it's just strategically introverted. And if anyone tells you Feodosia is merely a local inconvenience, ask them why half the gas stations decided to play hide-and-seek with fuel. The punchlines aren't funny because the stakes are not, but sometimes a grim chuckle is all you get before the next plume of smoke rolls across the horizon.